The driver is missing that critical step in checking that bleeder valve inside that pod.
Why are we having spills because of that little bleeder valve?
If you miss that step, because this is what happens. The previous driver who had finished his load, he opened up his bleeder valve to evacuate air and pressure off of that line before he disconnected. Well, he or that previous driver is going to leave that valve open. So when the new driver comes in and to get the next load off that facility, he misses that step. A lot of drivers instinctively close the lid on that pod, and they completely miss the fact that that valve is open. So it's a matter of seconds or minutes later, that pod's gonna fill up, overflow. Now the pump is running on the truck. The truck engine is running. You're not hearing that splash or that sound of oil hitting the floor or the ground. And it's a lot of drivers usually don't catch it until the loading process is complete, and that's when they determine I've left the valve open.
And that bleeder valve only needs to be partially open to fail.
That's exactly right. I mean, in order to not have a failure, the valve must be fully closed. Because as soon as you start opening up the tank valves, you are going to start having oil flowing under static pressure. And even under static pressure, even under a partially open valve, oil is going to start coming out, and first thing it does is it starts filling up the pod.
So a partially open valve will just spill later.
Correct. That's right. But in most instances, I'm going to tell you, that valve is going to be fully open because the previous driver who got finished with his load, he opened it up fully to exhaust any pressure from that line before he disconnected.
Some of these bleeder valves are spring-loaded.
Some of them are. However, it's been my personal past experience that a lot of those bleeder valves were put in place to try to fix that issue, but the spring inside the valve eventually becomes worn and or broken, and it quits working altogether, and then it just becomes a regular mechanical type open close valve.
You can't just look at it and think, oh, that's spring-loaded, I'm okay.
Exactly. You have to double check.
You have to put your hand on it.
You have to put your hands on it and check it.
What can a driver do to remember that bleeder valve, given how important it is?
Well, one of the things that a driver does need to do is get into a routine. And one of the routines is checking to make sure that all the valves that are open are supposed to be open, and all the valves that are supposed to be closed are closed. It's a good practice to get into. It's running the lines, and then it's double checking everything. I highly recommend that when a driver gets connected and starts opening up valves under static pressure, to double check, make sure that you don't have any leaks at the connections, make sure that you don't have a gasket that's leaking out a hose, make sure the bleeder valve is closed. It's checking, and then it's double checking and establishing that routine and keeping that routine. A good driver who stays in attendance that has that type of routine will have minimal trouble.
Do you think that during the loading process, a driver should walk over and take a look?
Absolutely, because one of the other issues that we have is a driver remaining in attendance while loading and unloading. I believe that a driver must remain in attendance during the entire process, because when there's a leak or a rupture, all that can be mitigated with a driver just being in attendance, someone being there to immediately close valves, turn off a pump, and checking the process throughout the loading. Just making sure that nothing's leaking, It's part of our job. It's part of our responsibility to do that. A kind of set it and forget it mentality is what leads us to these enormous costly spills.
So check, recheck.
Check and recheck. Check, double check, and then check again.
Will you define what you mean by remaining in attendance?
My definition of a driver who's in attendance is a person who stays within the controls of the trailer. One never knows when a hose may burst. There may be a valve that may close automatically, depending on the situation. But any spill can be mitigated if a driver is there at the controls to stop the process, to close a valve, to turn off a pump, stop the oil from flowing, stop the oil from hitting the ground. Oil that hits the ground goes far and fast. And it's always easy to tell a person who was in attendance versus a person who just was not. If the engine is running, the AC is blowing, the pump is running, it's hard to hear that stuff, those type things, when you are sitting in the cab of the truck versus in attendance at the controls of the trailer. Now, don't get me wrong, there's going to be damage, there's going to be oil on the ground, even if a driver was sitting right there, but the difference between the amount that's on the ground from a driver who was sitting in the cab versus one who was in attendance is tremendous. And that equals cost. That's going to come out of the company's pocket. That hits the bottom line. The company's going to be responsible for any remediation. Companies that paying a company essentially to come out there, clean up the oil, dispose of it, of the contaminated soil, time, machinery, people, all that's money. So it not only has an effect on that person, because that person may result, the end result for that person may be they lose their job as a result of it. But the reverberating effect that it has across the company is that was money spent to have to clean up a spill, which pretty much any spill, a lot of spills are preventable, but that has a reverberating effect amongst the whole company.
We're talking about negligence here. We're not talking about mechanical failures or just things beyond the driver's control. We're talking about something that was 100% preventable.
Absolutely. I mean, things are going to happen. And see, that brings me back to the point of being in attendance, because things can happen all on our own. You could have a pump failure, you could have a valve failure, you could have, and more common, a hose failure. If somebody can tell me when a hose is going to fail, I would like to meet that person, because I don't know when a hose is going to fail. It's just like I don't know when H2S is gonna hit. That's why we wear a monitor, and that's why we mitigate that issue by being in attendance. So if a hose were to fail, we can close a valve, turn a pump off, and mitigate the problem. But like I said, where I've seen the damage, the devastation is from a person who was not in attendance. They were in the cab. Their attention was being focused elsewhere. Unfortunately, we've had people get so comfortable in that cab they fall asleep during the loading process and overfill a trailer. I mean, all those type things are preventable. A lot of drivers want to use the defense, well, I didn't leave it open. The driver previous to me left it open. Well, the responsibility is always going to fall onto the shoulders of the loading driver. You had a responsibility to make sure that valve was fully closed before you started opening up any valves.
So do you think it matters how long a driver's been hauling oil to have these bleeder valve incidents occur?
It's funny you should say that, because I think it's been my experience that not only have we seen this happen with new drivers, we've seen it happen with older tenured drivers, simply because of the fact that complacency is it's a tough thing. It's something that a driver just gets comfortable or too comfortable with the process. It's like driving that truck up and down the road. I interviewed a driver one time that had a rollover accident, and that driver told me that I've made that turn hundreds of times. And he had been with us for quite some time, so I believe that he probably made that turn hundreds of times. So a bleeder valve is something that or the loading process in general is something that's just, somebody's gonna get comfortable with it, too comfortable with it, because hey, I've had 100 uneventful events, but it's the 101st event, 101st loading, where you're going to have a hose burst, or you're going to have a bleeder valve open, or you're going to have some type of failure, and you've gotten used to sitting in the truck, or you've gotten used to just not being in attendance, and that's when you're going to have an issue. It's going to happen when you least expect it, number one. And number two, somebody like myself who's been with the company for quite some time and have dealt with these issues over and over, I know immediately, just by looking at size and scope, where you were when that issue occurred. We've had lots of drivers that have been working here for lots of years that have never had an issue with it. And when you talk to them and ask them, what are your secrets? What would you pass down? Is, well, number one, they'll tell you is follow the rules. Just follow the rules. It's real simple. Follow the rules, follow the procedures, stay in attendance when you load and unload. Be there in case something happens. To me, a good driver looks at things, puts things into perspective, and realizes that there could be an issue, that something could happen. And that could happen mentality keeps them aware, keeps them on their toes, and keeps them vigilant. And those are the people that come to work day in, day out, and don't have a problem.
So is there ever any excuse, any reason whatsoever where a driver would be sitting in the cab while the truck is loading and you guys would say, well, yeah, I understand?
No, I couldn't give them there's not a good excuse for that. There just isn't.
Because if you need to get in your cab, you stop your load.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've had instances where, hey, during the process, the driver had to excuse himself to go use the restroom. That's fine. Turn the pump off, close your valve, go take care of your business, and walk back and then resume. There's millions of things that could go wrong while you're gone, while you're not in attendance. And it'll be obvious. And it's not just obvious to us, it's going to be obvious to our customer, because they too have dealt with a driver who was in attendance versus a driver who was not.